Oh, sorry. How's it going, everybody? Uh, it's kind of shabby. All right, I'm about to be heading off to bed real soon. But I've been just so blessed. I kind of hate. Um, I don't really know an appropriate word to say, but I guess. Oh, snap! Rotate device. Oh, it's actually a lot like that. That kind of sucks. Mm, 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 mm. Oh wait, yeah. I don't know why I missed that. Okay. So yeah, so I'm gonna be attempting to break this down. Uh, that's gonna be kind of distracting. Um, be real distracting. All right, let's just try that. Let's try something like of that. All right, sorry, got my little hair. Actually, that's fine. Yeah, let's put that up there. This is a breakdown anyway. You don't really need to see my face. You don't need to see me. Okay. Yeah, first Corinthians 17. Okay, now for the matters you wrote about, it is good for a man not to marry. I mean, it is good for a man not to marry. Uh, it is good for a man not to marry. B, or it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. But since there is so much immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The okay, which is kind of weird because I read a scripture, a different version. It was like the easy to read Bible, and it didn't have that little uh, snippet there that maybe I have to reread it, but I didn't find it in there. It's kind of strange. But uh, the passage does this verse. It does say because there's so much immorality, a man should have his own wife, and each woman should have her own husband. So contextually speaking, is due to the situation, due to the context of the time, there was a lot of immorality. The response um, of the person or kind of replying to their message, replying to the questions that they had, I would say he says is good for a man not to marry. That's very strange. I'm gonna have to reread that somewhere. Um, okay, so he says is good. It is good for. And also, I have the New International Version, and it's a women's devotional. But yeah, it's New International Version. So how's it going, person? I don't know who you are, but yeah, how's it going? I'll try not to be too. Try to be mindful. Try to be mindful. I get self conscious when people are watching, but the husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife's body does not belong to her alone, but also to her husband. In the same way, the husband's body does not belong to him alone, but also to his wife. Given that, um, I was thinking to myself, I mean, as I was reading the easy to read version, easy to read Bible, is that a lot of these, from what it sounds like to me, a lot of the relationships, especially the poor ones, are very one sided. You know, whether it's manipulation or abuse, it's a very one sided selfishness, selfish kind of love. Um, and it's like because in I guess based off what I've just read, they both have a responsibility to each other, and not just a responsibility. It's almost like a duty. You know, I don't know. I'm using these words, but there's a better word I'm thinking of. But they say that like okay, because in response to immorality, they should be with each other now, and they have to fulfill their duties, their marital duties, and because they don't belong to each other. So if I was with a person married, I don't belong to myself anymore, you know. And the woman, she doesn't belong to herself, but she belong. I belong to her, and she belongs to me. And you may think, I mean, from what I could tell, I could guess that oh, that sounds pretty, that sounds cute, that sounds like, sounds romantic. It sounds like something that would be in a story. But given that, because a wife is no longer her own self, but she is her husband, and likewise, the husband is no longer himself, it implies to me a selfless behavior, a behavior in which both people are taking care of each other's needs, because they're not living for themselves anymore. They're living for each other, and of course um that's going to call for selflessness. That's going to call for communication. It's going to call for just understanding each other. And also, it made me think about how people just like what I dare to say it, feminism. And I'm not gonna say all feminism. I think the heart of it was it makes sense, but today is just like it's suggesting like not owning yourself, not belonging to yourself is oppressive. And it's like from this verse, both parts, I guess just contextually indifference, they don't belong to each other, you know. I'm sorry, they don't belong to themselves. It's not a selfish issue. It's a it is a relationship, a style that is kind of like, is it codependent? But it's like mutually codependent, you know. But at the same time, I don't know if it's codependent because again, it's like unhealthy relationships can be codependent, where it's like the person establishes is one sided. A person presents themselves as the person who is needed, and the other person is the person who establishes that need to that person. And so one person latches on, and the person gives them a reason to continue to latch on, versus both parties latching onto each other and really caring about each other. And it's not just a lovey-dovey thing. It's like legitimate caring about each other's well-being. You know, whether it's their sexual needs or physical needs or whatever. They care about each other. Like they're not thinking about themselves. And like for instance, that's like I guess I can give an example. Let's say let's say guy number B, guy A, or guy B and wife A. Let's say wife A looks at guy B and says, "You're overweight. You're not looking too good. You should go. We're going. You need to get to a doctor." And then uh, guy number B says, "Well, okay, we're married, so I'm gonna go to the doctor." At least this is my guesswork. This is guesswork, but it's like, or it's like, guy B will tell I'm sorry, husband B will tell wife A, wife, you might want to go to the dentist, you know, and she says okay, you know, or or wife A may suggest, um, husband, your eating habits are not good, you know, perhaps you should probably do some things, and I'll help you do that. I don't know. Again, these are very lighthearted. I'm not married. I'm just going off the text and just making guesses. I'm doing guesswork. Um. Okay. So given that they don't belong, their bodies don't belong to each other. I mean, their bodies don't belong, yeah, to each other, but is in each other's care, in each other's possession. Um, Again, this is all in responses to just sexual immorality uh, in the church at the time. Now, do not deprive each other. I'm going to continue. Do not deprive each other except by mutual consent and for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Okay, do not deprive each other. Part of that, I guess, eh, the things that come to mind for me is, I mean, I would think sex, but a part of it is definitely, like, for instance, the love languages, the way we express our love, do not deprive each other. And so perhaps it's kind of like um, the opposite of mercy. I don't know. I'm not gonna say that, but I'll say don't deprive each other. So if a person is starving for physical love, don't don't starve them of physical love. If that person is starving for time, quality time with you, don't starve them of quality time. If that person is starving for um, gifts, don't starve them of gifts. If that person is starving for um, there's touch, there's time, there's physical, there's words of affirmation. If a person is lacking words of affirmation, perhaps it's good for that person to uh, be quelled through words of affirmation. And so forth and so forth, so on. So again, that makes sense because you guys are filling each other's will. You know, if both parties can be selfless and both parties have what the other person's needing, all they have to do is to commit and to continuously fill each other's will. And I think part of that is going to be just that commitment, that not just that commitment, but compatibility. You know, again, like we're all different. I used to think to myself, why is it that is there such a thing that people could just pick any person? Well, there's that compatibility, and part of that compatibility introduces attraction. So definitely, um, I mean, not really. I mean, could you say technically? Technically, yeah, because they're Christian, but would it work out because of two different compatibilities? Only in Christ the work is of Christ. But due to the nature of this scripture, it sounds like it's a possibility, but definitely it would be easier to find somebody that is appropriate. Appropriate for yourself, for your person. And that is not one-sided love or a fake love or a superficial love or a just an empty kind of empty incomplete love. And again, I'm not an example. I'm just taking guesses, taking thought mindful guesses. Okay. I say this as a concession, not as a command. So it is what concession suggestion. I'll say it similar. I wish that all men were as I am, but each man has his own gift from God. One has this gift, another has that. Now to the unmarried and the widows. Okay, wait, before I do that, that all of this is great advice. I like to think it's great advice. And again, it makes perfect sense. But giving this concession, I guess, is not supposed to be stuck in stone. You know, I wonder if a lot of these. It all really depends. You just have to read it. There's the book is heavily contextualized. It has a lot of things in it. Um, so if he says this is concession, not a command, it's not something that you have to do, but it would be helpful to do. Which is interesting because it's like people come from different places in life. Um, yeah, it's it would be nice to not have those urges to marry, but he says I have a gift. I wish everybody was like me, but we all got different gifts. One person has one thing, the other person has another thing. I talked about the widows and the unmarried. Now to the unmarried and the widows, I say it is good for them to stay unmarried as I am. But if they cannot control themselves, they should marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. Uh, okay. I don't know. That's kind of self-explanatory, right? You know, married and widows, stay married, and if you can't, get married. Again, um, because it's a concession, as he spoke about before. Um, Actually, let's continue to read. I think it's gonna be because the Bible tends to answer its own questions. Um, But if they cannot control themselves, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. To thee, Mary, I give this command, not I, but the Lord. A wife must not be separate from her husband. But if she does, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. And a husband must not divorce his wife. To the rest I say this, that I, but not I, oh, I, not the Lord. If any brother has a wife who is not a believer, and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. That's an interesting tale, you know. Um, it seems to me that the Bible condemns divorce, you know. But aren't we, we're like saved in Christ, right? There's no condemnation. Well, yeah, and that's where the tricky part of understand of the doctrines and, are we saved? Well, perhaps we are saved, but I like to think there's danger in in dishonoring the commands of God. It's not just it's disobedience, yes. It's a sin. It's missing the point, which is what sin is, to miss the point. I'm sorry, miss the mark, but basically miss the point, miss the mark of you know, yeah, I guess miss the part. Um, but given in Christ, we are new creatures. Um, we have new desires. We have new goals and ambitions and things of that nature. It's just better. It's best to follow. Best to follow what the scriptures call, because it's not hard. But especially with this one, um, it's good to stick with a divorced person. I mean, I'm sorry, not a divorced person. It's good to stick with a non-believer. If you are already believing, if you become believed, your spouse and you, if you both were unbelievers and you happen to be a believer, I mean, become a believer, then you say it's best to stay with them if that person is willing. If that person is willing, and it says, and if a woman has a husband who is not a believer and is willing to live with her, she must not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband has been sanctified or made holy through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her believing husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, as it is they are holy. So, to me, it references in Genesis the two shall become one flesh. So, given that in this union of marriage, it's almost is to me it reminds me of a Jewish mother, where it's like, since she's Jewish, her children are Jewish. From what I understand, I could be wrong about that, but yeah, it's like, uh, but I know the opposite. If the man is Jewish, then I don't think those privileges apply. But that's just what I'm guessing. I could be wrong about that. It's just what I've heard. But to me, it makes sense. But sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her believing husband. Otherwise, the children will be unclean. So, I find it very interesting, because it's like the Christian person is, I'm not gonna put any words in there. I was gonna say it bleeds their righteousness over, and I guess that makes sense. I thought that was gonna be bad, but that doesn't sound too bad. Their righteousness bleeds over to the other non-believer spouse as well as their children. So that's pretty darn cool. If the unbeliever leaves, let him do so. So no forcing. Like, maybe your love is strong, but if that person is not willing to stay with you in this change, and yes, you may be hurt, but the Bible says you gotta let him go. Let him all go. They can't take you being a Christian, and they just like, man, I just can't do it. I just and they just, yeah, just gotta let it go. A believing man or woman is not bound in such circumstances. God has called us to live in peace. How do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? Nevertheless, each one should retain the place in life that the Lord assigned him to and to which God has called him. This is the rule I lay down in all my church. Lay down in all the churches. Okay, that makes sense. All right, now I'm going to move to a bit more controversial one, but it totally answers it. It totally answers it, especially in 1 Corinthians 7:21. Please listen. Nevertheless, each one should retain the place in life that the Lord assigned him to, into which God has called him. So keep the place in life that God has assigned you and where God has called you. So if He calls you a particular place and where He's assigned you, you stay there. And yeah, I don't know. Maybe God leads different people, but I don't know. I'm reading from the text, and that's what I got. Go where He called you. Go where He's leading you. He should not become. Oh, was a man already circumcised when he was called? He should not become uncircumcised. Was a man uncircumcised when he was called? He should not be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing. Okay, wait. For uh, yeah, circumcision is nothing. Well, actually, let's get back to it. So, of course, you have the understanding of the Jewish tradition that to be circumcised is a very is what is it? I don't know if there's earlier teachings, but it's a very early teaching that kind of symbolizes was it Jewishhood? I don't know. I'm not entirely sure of that term, but it's one of those things that they do, and one of those things that show that hey, they're part of this fold. Now, given that, the Bible say, wherever you were. So if you were uncircumcised, don't try to be circumcised. And I'm pretty sure the people back in the day were saying you need to be circumcised to accept fully the teaching of Christ, because even today there's people having extra, just excessive doctrine to tell you that you have to be saved to do X, Y, and Z. And I don't want to get in that because that's very hairy, but they say whatever position you were in, you stay in that position. You stay in that position. But in this regard, it's definitely talking about circumcision. So it says circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing. Keeping God's commandments is what counts. And of course, there are people who use just that one term in 19 that keeping God's commandments is what counts, and just twist it and turn it into whatever they feel. And that's just tiresome. But again, the Bible answers itself, typically within the same chapter. Each one should remain in the situation in which he was in and when God called him. Were you a slave when you were called? Implications behind that. If you're a slave when you're called in Christ? You're a slave when you're called in Christ. What are you going to do? Does that mean you're going to be a slave forever, man? Because I'm like, he say, hey, if you're uncircumcised, you better stay uncircumcised. You circumcised, you better stay circumcised. All right, let's read. And this, were you a slave when you were called? Don't let it trouble you. Although if you can gain your freedom, do so. Don't let it trouble you. Don't stress over being a slave. Although if you can gain your freedom, do so. Think about that. I mean, are you kidding me? You telling me people forgot about this verse? They forgot. They forgot the entire verse. Jesus was like, here it is, Or is this Paul? Making big man statements. Big facts. Big facts. That's very funny. You say, okay, if you're a slave, be a good slave. But if you can get your freedom, do so. There. Congrats, we did it. It's Christ. And I like to think, shout out to the abolitionists who thought that, who probably read this book. It would probably be read and was like, yeah, they can't say slaves anymore. So shout out to them, no matter who they are, what color. Shout out to the people who are doing right with that abolitionist. It was like, it's got to do that. Okay, now continuing on. For he who was a slave when he was called by the Lord is the Lord's freedman. Similarly, he who was a free man when he was called is Christ's slave. Remember when I was talking about how poor relationships, are one sided? In American culture, consider that. And of course, I'm not going to say, I remember Roots, where Chicken George, was it Chicken George? I guess that was his nickname. He realized he was like I guess that's those implications are different. But basically, he he was basically the product of rape, and the slave master, um, I think he gave him a bill. Like after he realized that, he gave him his freedom. That's what I remember. I could be wrong, but think about the dynamics between it. Think about it. Think about that very heavily, very carefully. The slave is free in Christ. Again, people say that's BS, but I'm saying these are for the people who really believe. And the slave owner is a slave to Christ. They consider that very closely, very hard. If I'm a slave and I'm now free in Christ, my mentality is that of a free person. If I am a slave owner and I own these slaves, yet I am a slave to Christ, and also if they have the opportunity to be free, they should be free. I would imagine on the aspect that they both live in some sort of duty to Christ. Firstly and foremost, I don't think there's evidence of American chattel slavery demonstrating that. A whole lot of Bible waving, but no demonstration of actual Bible principles such as that. They believe in Jesus. Again, it's one sided because they sat there and indoctrinated slaves. I don't care what Old Testament tell them. It's not that Old Testament typically are things for us to learn to point to the new. Those aren't commands for us per se, unless we're trying to follow every Old Testament law. Otherwise we learn from the stuff that was carried over to the New Testament, and we learn from what is told to us post Christ and during Christ. Okay, so given that the circumstance and the potential relationship between a slave and a freedman, not the slave owner and the slave, we're supposed to be essentially one and the same. Supposed to be both service under Christ. Now let's continue on 23. I'm sorry, this is very long, but I really want to get this through. You were bought at a price. You did not become slaves of men. So because the freedman is a slave of Christ, he was bought at a price. The slave owner was bought at a price. He's a slave to Christ. Think about that. You're a slave to Christ. So it's like, again, if you consider that heavily. If you were bought at a price, this isn't just like for any person, contextually speaking, these are indeed the brothers and sisters, but these were also talking to slave owners and slaves. And he say, slave owner, you are a Christ slave. You are his servant. And slaves, you are free in Christ. So given those two notions, to be free and also a slave, or to have these positions that were once static and in power are now equalized, to suggest that they've both been bought at a price, just like a slave had been in the time, been bought. They're now property. Now we're Jesus's property. We're, if you want to count it as that, I wouldn't say go as far as to say like the. I mean, I guess you could call it that because we bought, but it's like to have it more appropriate. I would just suggest a living slave, because chattel slavery and Jewish slavery and stuff weren't the same. They just weren't. It was just a, I don't know what you'd call it, but it's a poor version of what slavery used to be. Brothers, each man as responsible to God should remain in the situation God called him to. It keeps telling you that. Remain in the position that you were called to. Remain in the position you were called to. In Christ, remain in the position you were called to. So does that mean you have to change? You have to fulfill someone's expectations? No, be where you're at. Be where you're at. So, again, if you're due with tattoos, perhaps you keep the tattoos. Remain where you're at. Remain where Christ has called you. When he drew you out of darkness, he didn't tell you to get yourself cleaned up. He says, remain where you were called. So God's putting a strong burden and a confidence in you to change, a willingness to change, a change heart to change, to in response to his love and kindness. Don't change unless, at least that's what I'm saying. I'm not, this is a guess, this is an inference based off what I've read, but he says keep yourself in that position. You're uh, I guess that does require a further explanation, but one I don't know if I'd be able to appropriately give. But the most I can say is you've been bought at a price. But again, to illustrate that point even far more closely, slaves and freedmen. I keep mentioning this because it's very important, and it's something that we really miss when we try to talk about. Because I think we feel like we miss the imagery, we miss the weight, because he does it in comparing a slave owner and a slave, a bond servant, a slave, a person who is under someone in payment, who has to serve them, been bought by some other person, by a slave owner, another slave owner, and now is a slave. I mean, if this was Jewish, since they love to bring up the Jewish stuff, just loopholes that gives them freedom. But in this one, they're all equal in price. And it's not just a figurative equality. This is a literal equality. A literal equality. Because everybody's under Christ. Everybody's been bought. Everybody's a slave under Christ. That means white people. That means black people. That means Asian. That means whoever believes. And it's not, oh man, people need to understand whatever. It's like, no, understand the position. We are all under. We are all been bought by some other guy's sacrifice. We have freedom because another person bought us out, bought us out of darkness with himself. So now we serve him. We serve in response to that. But we serve with our lives. We've been bought. We've been, I don't know, it's just like the gravity of it. We've been bought. So given that, we're all the slaves. We're slaves. We are no longer slaves to the things we used to be, but now we're slaves to Christ, slaves to the Spirit, slaves to righteousness. So given all that, remain in the situation God called you to. And that's your position. That's the, you know, circumcised, uncircumcised, slave free. Um, and that's a state in itself. It's like, what does it mean? What situation? Maybe is it every situation? I don't know. Now about virgins. I have no command again from the Lord.